The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of the royal palace of Valdoria as Prince Alexander William Theodore adjusted his navy blazer one final time. At 38 years old, he had attended countless official functions, but today felt different. Today, he would sit down with Brazilian journalist Maria Santos for what palace officials were calling the most personal interview of his royal career. Alexander gazed out the tall windows of his private study, watching the palace gardeners tend to the rose gardens his late mother had planted 25 years ago. The roses were in full bloom now, their deep red petals catching the early light. It seemed fitting somehow that this interview, scheduled to discuss his family life and personal struggles, would take place during the season when her memory felt strongest. "Your Highness, the car will be ready in 15 minutes, announced James Patterson, his private secretary, stepping quietly into the room. James had served the royal family for nearly 2 decades and understood the weight of today's arrangement better than most. Alexander nodded, his fingers drumming nervously against the leather surface of his desk. The interview had been months in the planning. Maria Santos, one of Brazil's most respected journalists, had approached the palace through diplomatic channels after her moving documentary about single fathers had won international acclaim. She wanted to explore the human side of royalty, particularly how Alexander balanced his duties as future king, with raising his 3 children following his wife's tragic death in a car accident 2 years prior. The prince walked to his desk and picked up a silver-framed photograph showing him with his children at last summer's royal polo match. Princess Isabella, now 14, stood tall and poised beside him, her dark hair gleaming in the sunlight. Prince Michael, 12, grinned widely while holding a polo mallet nearly as tall as himself. Little Princess Sophie, only 8, sat perched on Alexander's shoulders, her arms wrapped around his neck and her face bright with laughter. Those had been simpler times, before the constant scrutiny that followed Catherine's death, before the endless speculation about his fitness as a single father, before the pressure from Parliament and the press about remarrying for the good of the kingdom. The photograph captured a moment of pure joy that felt increasingly rare in their current reality. "Sir, if I may," James said softly, recognizing the melancholy that had settled over his employer's features. "This interview represents an opportunity to show the world who you really are, not the tabloid version or the formal royal they see at state functions, but the father who reads bedtime stories and helps with homework." Alexander set the photograph back in its place and turned to face James. "Do you think I'm making the right choice, opening our lives to this scrutiny?" James considered the question carefully. He had watched Alexander struggle through the darkest period of his life, had seen him emerge stronger but forever changed. "Your Highness, you have nothing to hide. Your devotion to your children is evident to anyone who spends time around the palace. Perhaps it's time the world saw that devotion as well." The decision to participate in the interview had not come easily. Alexander's advisors were split down the middle. Some argued that royal privacy should be maintained at all costs, that personal revelations would only invite more intrusion. Others believed that in an age of social media and constant connectivity, the monarchy needed to show its human face to remain relevant. The tipping point had come during a particularly difficult evening 3 months ago. Princess Isabella had come to him in tears after reading cruel comments online about their family. Strangers on the internet were questioning his ability to raise his children properly, suggesting that the royal children needed a mother figure, implying that he was somehow failing them by remaining unmarried. That night, as he held his eldest daughter and tried to explain that the opinions of strangers didn't define their family's worth, Alexander realized that silence was no longer an option. The narrative about their lives was being written by others, often inaccurately and without compassion. This interview would give him the chance to tell their story in his own words. "The children understand what today means?" Alexander asked as they walked through the palace corridors toward the main entrance. "Princess Isabella does, certainly. She's quite mature for her age. Prince Michael has grasped the basics, and Princess Sophie knows that Daddy will be talking to a nice lady about their family." James paused at the top of the grand staircase. "They're proud of you, sir. They wanted you to know that." The comment brought a genuine smile to Alexander's face for the first time that morning. His children had been remarkably resilient throughout their ordeal, but he worried constantly about the long-term effects of growing up under such intense public scrutiny. Every school event, every family outing, every moment of their lives was potentially front-page news. As they descended the marble steps, Alexander's mind wandered to the early days following Catherine's death. The funeral had been a state affair, watched by millions around the world. But afterward, when the cameras went away and the official mourning period ended, he had been left alone with 3 grieving children and no roadmap for moving forward. The palace staff had been wonderful, particularly Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, the children's nanny who had become more like family than an employee. But at the end of each day, when the official duties were complete and the children were asleep, Alexander faced the profound loneliness of single parenthood in the fishbowl of royal life. "Your Majesty, the motorcade is ready," announced Captain David Morrison, head of royal security, as they reached the main entrance. David had served in the Special Air Service before joining the Royal Protection Detail and approached his duties with military precision. Alexander nodded and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. 3 Black Range Rovers waited in formation, their engines already running. The familiar routine of royal travel had become second nature over the years, but today the security felt especially important. This interview would likely generate significant media attention, and David's team had spent weeks coordinating with Brazilian authorities to ensure safe passage. As the motorcade pulled away from the palace, Alexander watched the familiar landmarks of his homeland fade into the distance. They would fly from the royal airfield to Sao Paulo, where Maria Santos would meet them at a private location chosen for its discretion and comfort. The interview would be conducted over 2 days, allowing for natural conversation rather than rushed sound bites. The flight to Brazil would take nearly 12 hours, providing time for final preparations and reflection. Alexander's media advisor, Sarah Chen, had prepared briefing notes covering potential questions and suggested talking points, but he had decided to largely set aside the formal preparation in favor of speaking from the heart. "Sir, will be arriving at the airfield in 10 minutes, David announced through the intercom system. "Weather conditions in Sao Paulo are excellent, and our advance team reports no security concerns." Alexander leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself a moment of calm before the whirlwind began. This interview would be unlike anything he had done before. No formal talking points about trade relations or cultural exchanges. No carefully scripted responses about royal duties and constitutional responsibilities. Just a father talking about his children, his struggles, and his hopes for the future. The Range Rover turned through the gates of the royal airfield, where the family's private aircraft waited on the tarmac. The Airbus A319 had been configured specifically for royal travel, with a private office, bedroom, and meeting area that would allow Alexander to maintain his duties even while in transit. As he boarded the aircraft, Alexander was greeted by Flight Commander Patricia Wells, who had been flying royal missions for over 15 years. "Good morning, Your Highness. We're expecting smooth conditions for the flight to Sao Paulo. Estimated arrival time is 6:30 p.m. local time." The aircraft's interior reflected the understated elegance that characterized the Valdorian royal family. Rich navy leather seats were arranged around polished wood tables, and the walls displayed landscape paintings from the kingdom's most celebrated artists. It was comfortable without being ostentatious, practical while maintaining the dignity expected of a royal aircraft. Once they were airborne, Alexander settled into his office area with a cup of tea and pulled out a leather portfolio containing photographs from the past 2 years. Sarah had suggested that having visual prompts might help him articulate the more emotional aspects of their journey. The first photograph showed Princess Isabella at her school's science fair, standing proudly beside a project about renewable energy. She had inherited her mother's brilliant mind and her father's determination, throwing herself into her studies as a way of coping with grief. The project had won first place, but Alexander remembered being more proud of her resilience than her academic achievement. Another image captured Prince Michael during his first rugby match after Catherine's death. The boy had been reluctant to continue with sports, feeling that enjoying himself somehow dishonored his mother's memory. Alexander had spent hours explaining that Catherine would want him to pursue his passions, that living fully was the best way to honor her legacy. The photograph showed Michael scoring his first try of the season, his face radiant with joy and accomplishment. The most poignant image was of little Princess Sophie during her first day at a new school. The previous school had become impossible due to media attention and the curiosity of other parents. In the photograph, she clutched Alexander's hand tightly while wearing her new uniform, her eyes wide with uncertainty but her chin raised with determination. She had adapted beautifully to the new environment, but the transition had broken Alexander's heart. "Sir, we're beginning our descent into Sao Paulo," announced Flight Commander Wells over the intercom. "Local time is 6:15 p.m. and weather conditions are clear." Alexander looked out the window at the sprawling city below, its lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Sao Paulo was home to over 12 million people, a vibrant metropolis that represented Brazil's economic and cultural dynamism. He had visited the country several times on official business, but never for something so personal. The aircraft touched down smoothly at Sao Paulo's private aviation terminal, where a small delegation of Brazilian officials waited to welcome the royal visitor. Foreign Minister Carlos Mendoza stepped forward as Alexander descended the aircraft steps, offering the formal greeting protocol required for such visits. "Your Highness, welcome to Brazil. I hope your flight was comfortable." "Thank you, Minister Mendoza. I'm honored to be here," Alexander replied, shaking hands warmly. Despite the formal nature of the greeting, there was genuine warmth in the exchange. Brazil and Valdoria had enjoyed excellent relations for decades. The motorcade for the journey to the hotel consisted of Brazilian government vehicles with discreet security presence. Alexander appreciated the low-key approach, which would help minimize attention from local media until the interview officially began. As they drove through the bustling streets of Sao Paulo, Alexander observed the vibrant street life, the mix of modern skyscrapers and historical architecture, the energy of a city that never seemed to sleep. It was exactly the kind of dynamic environment where honest conversation could flourish. The hotel chosen for the interview was a boutique property in the upscale Vila Madalena neighborhood, known for its artistic community and relative privacy. The management had cleared an entire floor to ensure confidentiality, and Maria Santos had already arrived to oversee the final preparations. "Tomorrow will change everything," Alexander said quietly to James as their car pulled into the hotel's private entrance. "After tomorrow, the children and I will never be quite as private as we are tonight." James nodded understanding. "But perhaps, sir, you'll never feel quite as alone either." Maria Santos arrived at the hotel at 8 in the morning, carrying a leather briefcase and a warm smile that immediately put everyone at ease. At 45 years old, she had built a reputation as one of Latin America's most insightful journalists, known for her ability to create comfortable environments where even the most guarded subjects felt safe to open up. Alexander met her in the hotel's private dining room, where breakfast had been arranged overlooking the vibrant streets of Vila Madalena. The morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting a golden glow over the simple but elegant table setting. This informal beginning was exactly what Maria had requested when planning the interview. "Your Highness, thank you for this opportunity," Maria said, extending her hand with genuine warmth. "I know this represents a significant step for you and your family." "Please call me Alexander," he replied, gesturing toward the comfortable armchairs arranged near the windows. "And thank you for coming all this way. Your documentary about single fathers was remarkable. It's part of what convinced me that this conversation was necessary." Maria had spent months researching not just Alexander's public life, but the broader context of modern single parenthood, particularly among public figures who faced constant scrutiny. Her approach was never sensationalist, but rather focused on the human truths that connected all parents facing similar challenges. They began with coffee and fresh fruit, allowing natural conversation to develop before the cameras started rolling. Maria had deliberately chosen to conduct the interview over 2 days, believing that meaningful dialogue required time to build trust and explore complex emotions. "I watched your speech at the Children's Mental Health Foundation last month," Maria said, stirring honey into her coffee. "When you spoke about helping children process grief, it was clear you were drawing from personal experience." Alexander nodded, his expression growing more serious. "Everything changed for us 2 years ago. Not just the obvious things, but small daily moments that I had never thought about before. Like having no one to discuss whether Isabella was ready for a more challenging math class, or whether Michael's sudden interest in cooking meant something deeper, or how to handle Sophie's nightmares without Catherine there to provide her unique comfort." The conversation flowed naturally, and Maria could see why Alexander's staff had described him as surprisingly open once he felt comfortable. Unlike many royal figures who spoke in carefully constructed phrases, Alexander seemed genuinely interested in exploring the complexities of his situation. "Tell me about the morning routine," Maria said. "I imagine that's where the reality of single parenthood hits hardest." Alexander laughed, the first truly relaxed moment since arriving in Brazil. "Chaos. Pure, beautiful chaos. Sophie needs help with her hair, Michael can never find his football boots, and Isabella tries to manage everyone while maintaining her own schedule. Mrs. Hartley, our nanny, is absolutely invaluable, but she arrives after we've already achieved maximum household entropy." "And you enjoy it?" "I treasure it," Alexander said without hesitation. "Those moments when we're all talking over each other, when Sophie is trying to tell me about a dream while Michael practices his Portuguese vocabulary and Isabella debates whether her science project needs more research time. It's when we feel most like a family rather than royal obligations." The cameras began rolling after lunch, positioned discreetly around the hotel's private library where the formal portion of the interview would take place. The room had been chosen for its warm, intimate atmosphere, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and comfortable leather furniture that encouraged honest conversation. "Alexander, when Catherine died, you became a single father overnight while also being heir to the throne," Maria began once they were seated. "How did you navigate those first impossible months?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I made a lot of mistakes. I tried to maintain the same public schedule while somehow believing I could shield the children from any additional disruption. I thought if I kept everything else normal, they wouldn't feel the full impact of losing their mother." "What changed your mind?" "Isabella, 3 months after the funeral, she came to me and said, 'Daddy, you don't have to pretend to be okay for us. We know you're sad too.' She was 12 years old and she was taking care of me. That's when I realized that authenticity, even painful authenticity, was better for all of us than performance." Maria leaned forward slightly. "What did that authenticity look like in practice?" "It meant canceling events when one of the children needed extra attention. It meant bringing them to some official functions instead of leaving them home. It meant admitting to my staff when I was overwhelmed and accepting help." Alexander paused, looking out the window at the bustling street below. "It meant letting them see me cry sometimes and talking openly about missing their mother." The conversation moved naturally to specific examples of how their lives had changed. Alexander described the decision to move from the main palace to a smaller residence on the grounds, creating more privacy and intimacy for their family life. He talked about learning to braid Sophie's hair through YouTube tutorials and his disastrous first attempts at helping with Isabella's chemistry homework. "Michael went through a phase where he was convinced he needed to be the man of the house," Alexander continued. "He was 10 years old, trying to carry groceries and open doors for his sisters, staying up late to make sure everyone was safe. It broke my heart because I realized he felt responsible for protecting everyone." "How did you handle that?" We had a long conversation about different types of strength. I explained that his job was to be a 10-year-old boy who loved his family, not a miniature adult carrying everyone's emotional weight. We established new traditions where everyone had specific responsibilities, but they were age-appropriate and focused on contribution rather than protection. Maria had prepared questions about the public scrutiny that followed Catherine's death, particularly the media speculation about Alexander's parenting choices and personal life. His responses revealed both frustration and acceptance of the unique challenges facing royal families. "The hardest part isn't the criticism of me," Alexander explained. "I signed up for public life, and I understand that scrutiny comes with privilege. But when strangers question whether my children are being properly cared for, when they suggest that growing up without a mother in the house will somehow damage them permanently, that's when the public nature of our lives feels cruel." "How do you protect them from that narrative?" "We talk about it openly at age-appropriate levels. Isabella understands more of the complexity now that she's 14. She knows that some people will always have opinions about our family, and she's learning to distinguish between constructive feedback and meaningless noise." Alexander smiled slightly. "She's actually quite fierce when it comes to defending our family dynamic. Last month, she wrote a letter to a newspaper editor correcting factual errors in an article about our household." The interview continued through the afternoon, covering topics from homework help to holiday traditions, from teaching the children about their future royal responsibilities to maintaining connections with Catherine's family. Alexander spoke candidly about the loneliness of single parenthood, particularly the absence of a partner with whom to share both daily decisions and long-term concerns. "People often ask if I plan to remarry," Alexander said toward the end of the day's session. "It's a natural question, and I understand the public interest. But right now, my focus is entirely on raising these three incredible children through their most formative years. Any future relationship would need to enhance their lives, not complicate them further." Maria respected the boundary Alexander was drawing around that topic, while acknowledging the genuine curiosity it generated. "What would you want people to understand about single-parent families, particularly those in the public eye?" "That we're doing our best with circumstances we didn't choose. That love isn't diminished by being provided by one parent instead of two. That children are remarkably resilient when they feel secure and supported." Alexander paused thoughtfully. "And that perfection isn't the goal. Connection is the goal." As the first day of filming concluded, Maria felt she had witnessed something unique in her journalism career. Royal figures rarely spoke with such emotional honesty, particularly about personal struggles and vulnerabilities. Alexander's willingness to share both his mistakes and his triumphs would likely resonate far beyond traditional royal watchers. "Tomorrow, would you be comfortable discussing the children more specifically?" Maria asked as they prepared to wrap up. "I'm particularly interested in how they've processed their mother's death and their own roles as young royals." Alexander considered the request carefully. "I think that would be valuable. They've each handled grief differently, and they've all shown remarkable maturity about their public roles. Isabella in particular has thoughts about modern monarchy that might surprise people." That evening, Alexander called home to check on the children before their bedtime. The conversation, conducted over secure video link, provided a glimpse into their normal family dynamics that would have delighted anyone questioning his parenting abilities. "Daddy, I got an A on my French essay," Sophie announced proudly, holding up her paper to the camera. "And I scored 2 goals at football practice," Michael added, still wearing his muddy kit. Isabella, more reserved but equally engaged, reported on her day's activities before asking seriously, "How is the interview going? Are you telling them true things about us?" "Only true things," Alexander assured her. "Tomorrow, Maria wants to talk about how you've all grown since Mummy died. Would you be comfortable with me sharing some of your thoughts about that?" Isabella considered this carefully, her mature reflection evident even through the video connection. "I think that would be good. People should know that we're okay. We miss Mummy every day, but we're okay." The simple wisdom of his eldest daughter reinforced Alexander's conviction that this interview was the right decision. His children weren't victims to be pitied or problems to be solved. They were remarkable young people who happened to be navigating grief and royal responsibilities simultaneously. As he prepared for bed in the luxurious hotel suite, Alexander reflected on the day's conversations. Opening up about the most difficult period of his life had been emotionally exhausting, but also strangely liberating. For 2 years, he had carried the weight of public judgment largely in silence, focusing on his children's needs while his own struggles remained private. Tomorrow's session would delve deeper into specific parenting challenges and the children's own perspectives on their unique situation. Maria had also requested permission to discuss Catherine more directly, exploring how her memory continued to influence their family life and the children's understanding of their mother's legacy. The morning would bring new challenges and revelations, but Alexander felt ready to continue the conversation. The response to this interview would likely be intense and divided, but the opportunity to share their story authentically was worth any temporary discomfort. Outside his window, Sao Paulo hummed with life even in the late evening hours. The city's energy reminded him that millions of families around the world were navigating their own versions of loss, adaptation, and hope. If sharing his family's journey could provide comfort or insight to even a few other single parents, the vulnerability would be justified. The second day began earlier than planned when Alexander received an unexpected video call from home at 6 in the morning Brazilian time. Princess Sophie had awakened with a fever and was asking for her father, creating the kind of parenting crisis that single parents face without backup. Maria arrived to find Alexander on the phone with Mrs. Hartley, the royal physician, and Isabella, coordinating Sophie's care from 4,000 miles away. Rather than seeing this as a disruption to their scheduled interview, Maria recognized it as an authentic glimpse into the daily reality of Alexander's life. "This is exactly what I hoped people would understand," Maria said quietly to her camera crew as they watched Alexander expertly juggle medical consultations, reassuring his youngest daughter, and managing his own obvious anxiety about being so far away during a health scare. "Sophie, sweetheart, Dr. Morrison says it's just a cold, but you need to rest today," Alexander said gently into the phone screen. "Isabella is going to help Mrs. Hartley take care of you, and I'll call again in 2 hours to check on you." "But Daddy, I want you here," Sophie said, her small voice thick with congestion and disappointment. "I know, my love. I want to be there too. But remember what we talked about. Sometimes Daddy has important work that helps other families, and that means we have to be brave when we're apart." Isabella appeared on screen beside her little sister, her 14-year-old composure remarkable. "Sophie, I'm going to read you the new Princess Alara book while you rest, and we'll make that special honey tea that Mummy used to make when we were sick." The mention of Catherine's honey tea recipe brought tears to Alexander's eyes, but also pride at how naturally Isabella had stepped into providing comfort using their mother's memory. These moments of inherited nurturing showed how Catherine's influence continued to shape their family life. After the call ended, Alexander sat quietly for a moment, gathering himself before continuing with the interview. Maria waited patiently, understanding that processing these emotions was part of the authentic experience she hoped to capture. "This is the hardest part of traveling for official duties," Alexander finally said. "Every parent worries when they're away and their child is sick, but most parents can rearrange their schedules or come home early. Royal obligations don't always offer that flexibility. How do you balance those competing demands?" "Imperfectly. There have been times when I've left important meetings to deal with a childhood crisis, and times when I've regretted prioritizing duty over presence." Alexander looked directly into the camera. "I want other single parents to know that the guilt never completely goes away, but the children are more understanding than we give them credit for." The conversation moved naturally into discussing each child individually, their distinct personalities, and how they had processed their mother's death differently. Alexander spoke with evident pride about Isabella's academic achievements and growing social consciousness. Isabella has always been intellectually curious, but losing her mother at 12 intensified her need to understand the world around her. She reads constantly, asks challenging questions about everything from climate change to social inequality. Alexander smiled fondly. "Last month, she presented me with a detailed proposal for making our royal estates carbon neutral by 2030. How do you handle her questions about difficult topics?" "With honesty appropriate to her age and maturity level. Isabella has lived through tragedy, so she knows the world isn't always safe or fair. Protecting her from reality would actually damage her ability to navigate it successfully." Alexander paused. "She's going to inherit significant responsibilities someday, so helping her develop critical thinking skills now is actually preparation for her future role." Maria had researched Isabella's academic record and public appearances, noting the young princess's poise and thoughtful responses in the few interviews she had given. "What does she think about her future role as a royal?" "She takes it seriously, but not solemnly. Isabella understands that privilege comes with responsibility, and she's genuinely excited about opportunities to address issues she cares about. But she also knows she has years to grow and learn before those responsibilities become primary." The discussion of Michael revealed a different dynamic. Where Isabella processed grief through intellectual exploration, Michael had responded with increased physical activity and social engagement. His rugby playing had intensified, and he had become more protective of both his sisters. Michael was closest to his mother in temperament. They shared an easy humor and natural warmth that drew people to them. Alexander's voice carried both affection and sadness. "After Catherine died, Michael seemed to feel responsible for maintaining that warmth in our family. He works very hard to make everyone laugh, sometimes at the expense of processing his own sadness." "How do you encourage him to express his own emotions?" "We've found physical activity helps him open up. Some of our best conversations happen during morning runs or while playing catch in the garden. Motion seems to help him find words for complex feelings." Alexander grinned. "And he's taught me quite a bit about rugby strategy, which has been an unexpected benefit." Maria had observed many family dynamics in her journalism career, and she was struck by how naturally Alexander spoke about adapting his parenting style to each child's needs. There was no sense of following a predetermined script, but rather genuine attention to understanding each child as an individual. Michael also has strong opinions about fairness and justice. Last year, when one of his teammates was being bullied for his accent, Michael organized the entire team to learn basic phrases in that boy's native language. The gesture was simple but powerful. The conversation about Sophie required more delicate handling, as she was still so young and had been only 6 when her mother died. Alexander's approach to helping her maintain connection to Catherine while building new memories was particularly poignant. Sophie remembers Catherine through sensory details rather than specific events. The smell of her favorite perfume, the sound of her laugh, the feeling of being held during bedtime stories. Alexander's voice softened. We've worked hard to keep those sensory memories alive through photographs, recordings, and maintaining some of Catherine's routines. What routines specifically? Catherine always made elaborate Sunday breakfasts with fresh flowers on the table and classical music playing. Sophie helps me prepare those breakfasts now, and we always set Catherine's place at the table with her favorite teacup. Alexander paused, clearly emotional. Sophie talks to the empty chair sometimes, telling her mother about her week. It might seem unusual, but our grief counselor says it's a healthy way for her to maintain connection. Maria was moved by the image of this small family, adapting their traditions to honor their loss while creating new bonds. How has Sophie adapted to being the baby of the family without her mother's attention? She's remarkably resilient, but she definitely seeks extra reassurance from all of us. Isabella and Michael are wonderful with her, and Mrs. Hartley provides essential maternal nurturing. Alexander smiled. Sophie has also become quite close to Catherine's mother, her grandmother Sarah, who spends significant time with us and shares stories about Catherine's own childhood. The afternoon session focused on the broader implications of royal single parenthood, including public expectations and media scrutiny. Alexander spoke candidly about the pressure to remarry for the stability of the monarchy versus his commitment to prioritizing his children's emotional needs. The Constitution doesn't require me to be married, but there's certainly an expectation that future monarchs will have stable family structures. Some commentators have suggested that remaining unmarried is somehow selfish or irresponsible. Alexander's tone carried frustration, but also resolve. I would never rule out future companionship, but any relationship would need to enhance our family dynamic rather than simply fulfill institutional expectations. How do the children feel about the possibility of you remarrying someday? They're surprisingly mature about it. Isabella has said she wants me to be happy and that she knows I loved their mother completely, but could still love someone else differently. Michael worries more about whether a new person would try to replace his mother's memory. Sophie just wants to make sure that anyone new would love her as much as Daddy does. Maria appreciated Alexander's honesty about the complexity of these family discussions. Many single parents struggled with similar conversations, but few had to navigate them under public scrutiny. The children have also been clear that they don't want anyone making decisions about their lives who hasn't earned that right through relationship and time. They're protective of our family unit in ways that are both touching and appropriate. The conversation turned to the practical challenges of royal protocol when managing a household with 3 children of different ages and needs. Alexander described the flexibility his staff had shown in adapting traditional routines to family priorities. Palace life has had to become much more child-centered since Catherine died. State dinners sometimes compete with science fair presentations, and I've learned to review briefing documents while supervising homework. Alexander laughed. My private secretary has become remarkably skilled at scheduling around school events and rugby matches. Do the children understand the sacrifices you've made in your public role to prioritize their needs? Isabella does, and she sometimes feels guilty about it. We've had to reassure her that choosing to be present for important moments in their lives isn't sacrifice, it's privilege. Alexander's expression grew serious. The monarchy will survive if I miss some ribbon cuttings, but my children's childhood won't repeat itself. As the formal interview sessions concluded, Maria reflected on the remarkable access Alexander had provided to his family's inner life. Royal figures typically maintained careful boundaries between public and private personas. But this conversation had revealed genuine vulnerability and authentic emotion. What do you hope people take away from hearing your story? That single-parent families can thrive with proper support, and that children facing loss are capable of remarkable resilience when they feel loved and secure. Alexander looked directly into the camera. I also hope other single parents, regardless of their circumstances, feel less alone in the challenges they're navigating. And what do you want the children to think when they watch this someday? That their father loves them completely, that their mother's memory is honored in how we've built our life together, and that they should be proud of how they've handled extraordinary circumstances with grace and courage. The evening concluded with Alexander making his promised call to check on Sophie, who was feeling much better and excited to show him a drawing she had made during her rest day. The simple family interaction, captured by Maria's crew with permission, provided a perfect ending to 2 days of unprecedented royal candor. As they prepared to depart Sao Paulo the following morning, Alexander felt both exhausted and relieved. The interview had been emotionally demanding but ultimately cathartic. For the first time since Catherine's death, he had shared their complete story publicly, trusting that honesty would serve his family better than continued privacy. The flight back to Valdoria provided Alexander with 12 hours to reflect on the weight of what he had just shared with the world. As the aircraft climbed through the Brazilian night sky, he found himself both anxious about the public response and deeply relieved that their story was finally told in his own words. Maria Santos had asked one final question as they concluded the interview that continued to resonate in his mind. What would Catherine think of the father you've become? The question had caught him off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it touched the heart of his deepest uncertainty. Settling into his private office aboard the aircraft, Alexander pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photographs from the past 2 years. Each image told part of the story he had shared with Maria, but together they revealed a family that had not just survived tragedy but had grown stronger through it. One photograph showed Isabella's first day at her new secondary school, chosen specifically for its academic rigor and commitment to treating royal students as normally as possible. She stood tall and confident in her uniform, but Alexander remembered the conversation they'd had the night before about whether other students would see her as a person or just a title. "Daddy, what if they only want to be my friend because I'm a princess?" she had asked, voicing a concern that had kept Alexander awake for hours. "Then you'll know they're not really your friends," he had replied. "Real friends will care about your thoughts, your kindness, and your sense of humor, not your title." The strategy had worked beautifully. Isabella had found a close group of friends who genuinely enjoyed her company and challenged her intellectually. Her best friend Emma was the daughter of a mathematics professor who had never shown any interest in royal protocol, but shared Isabella's passion for environmental science. Another image captured Michael during his most difficult period, about 8 months after Catherine's death. In the photograph, he sat alone on a garden bench, his rugby uniform muddy from practice, but his expression distant and sad. That had been the week when Michael had announced he no longer wanted to play rugby because it reminded him too much of watching matches with his mother. Alexander had struggled with how to respond. Part of him wanted to respect Michael's grief process and allow him to step away from activities that caused pain. But he also recognized that rugby provided Michael with healthy physical outlets and strong friendships that were crucial for his emotional development. The solution had come from an unexpected source. Captain Morrison from the Royal Protection Detail had played rugby professionally before joining the security team and offered to work with Michael on skills development. The one-on-one training had allowed Michael to reconnect with the sport gradually while building a mentoring relationship that helped him process his emotions. "Your mother loved watching you play because you played with such joy," Captain Morrison had told Michael during one of their sessions. "Stepping away from joy doesn't honor her memory. Finding your way back to joy does." The observation had proven transformative for Michael, who gradually returned to team practices with renewed enthusiasm and a deeper understanding of how to honor his mother's memory through positive action rather than protective withdrawal. Sophie's journey had been documented differently, partly because she was younger and partly because her processing of grief was more immediate and expressive. One video on Alexander's phone showed her having an animated conversation with Catherine's portrait in the family sitting room, telling her mother about her day at school and asking for advice about a playground disagreement. The palace staff had initially been concerned about Sophie's habit of talking to photographs and paintings of her mother, worrying that it indicated unhealthy attachment to the past. But the family's grief counselor, Dr. Amanda Foster, had reassured everyone that this kind of ongoing conversation was actually very healthy for children Sophie's age. Children process loss differently than adults, Dr. Foster had explained to Alexander during one of their regular sessions. Sophie is maintaining emotional connection while also building new relationships and experiences. The conversations with Catherine's image will naturally evolve as Sophie grows older. Indeed, Alexander had noticed that Sophie's conversations with her mother's portrait had become less about seeking permission or guidance and more about sharing exciting news and achievements. The shift indicated healthy emotional development while maintaining meaningful connection. The aircraft hit some mild turbulence, and Alexander looked out the window at the star-filled sky. In a few hours, they would land in Valdoria, and the careful privacy they had maintained around the interview would end. Maria's crew had been remarkably discreet, but news of the prince's personal interview would inevitably leak, generating speculation and commentary before the actual content was broadcast. Alexander's press secretary, David Chen, had prepared a comprehensive media strategy for managing the initial response. The interview would air in Brazil first, then be made available to international broadcasters with subtitles. Excerpts would likely appear on social media within hours of the initial broadcast, regardless of any attempts to control distribution. "Sir, we're expecting significant interest from global media outlets," David had briefed him before the trip. "Your last major interview was the official engagement announcement with Princess Catherine 8 years ago. This level of personal disclosure is unprecedented for the royal family." The comparison to his engagement interview highlighted how dramatically his life had changed. 8 years ago, he and Catherine had sat together answering gentle questions about their courtship and future plans, their happiness evident, and their future seemingly secure. They had fielded questions about children with laughing speculation about whether their future offspring would inherit Catherine's analytical mind or Alexander's stubborn determination. Now, those theoretical children were real people navigating the loss of the mother they had barely begun to know. The cruel irony was not lost on Alexander that Catherine had only lived to see Sophie's 6th birthday, missing most of her children's formative years and all of their future milestones. The aircraft's communication system chimed with an incoming message from the palace. James had sent an update on the children's activities during his absence. Isabella had received her mathematics exam results and scored the highest marks in her class. Michael had been selected for the regional rugby team despite being one of the youngest players, and Sophie had successfully performed in her school's winter concert, singing a solo she had dedicated to her mother's memory. Each piece of news filled Alexander with pride and, simultaneously, sadness that Catherine had missed these moments. He wondered constantly whether he was adequately filling the role of both parents or whether his children were missing crucial emotional support that only a mother could provide. Dr. Foster had addressed these concerns during their family therapy sessions, emphasizing that different family structures could provide equally strong foundations for children's development. "Your children are not lacking anything essential," she had assured Alexander. "They're experiencing loss, which is different from deprivation. They have abundant love, strong support systems, and a father who prioritizes their emotional well-being above all other considerations." The distinction between loss and deprivation had become central to how Alexander understood their family dynamic. His children missed their mother deeply and would always carry that loss, but they were not emotionally deprived or inadequately supported. The difference was crucial for his own psychological well-being as well as theirs. Another message arrived from Mrs. Hartley with photographs from the children's evening activities. Isabella was reading in her favorite armchair, surrounded by her cats and a stack of library books. Michael was practicing guitar in his room, working on a piece he planned to perform at the school's upcoming talent show. Sophie was in the kitchen with Mrs. Hartley, helping prepare tomorrow's lunch and chattering about her plans for the weekend. The images captured the normalcy that Alexander fought hard to maintain despite their extraordinary circumstances. These quiet evening routines grounded their family life in predictable rhythms that provided security and stability. Alexander drafted replies to each child, sending encouragement about Isabella's exam success, excitement about Michael's rugby selection, and pride about Sophie's concert performance. The technology that allowed him to maintain connection with his children during necessary travel was one of the few advantages of modern royal life. A third message arrived, this one from Foreign Minister Elizabeth Warren, updating Alexander on the diplomatic elements of his Brazil visit. Several trade agreements had been advanced during meetings held parallel to the interview schedule, and the Brazilian government had expressed interest in expanded cultural exchanges between their countries. The ability to combine personal storytelling with diplomatic advancement reflected the evolving nature of modern monarchy. Traditional rigid separation between public duty and personal life was becoming less sustainable in an age of global connectivity and social media transparency. Alexander appreciated that his Brazil interview would likely generate more international interest than typical diplomatic visits, potentially opening doors for future collaboration that might have taken years to develop through conventional channels. As the aircraft began its descent toward Valdorian airspace, Alexander could see the familiar lights of the capital city spreading below. The palace would be quiet at this hour, with the children asleep and the staff maintaining their overnight watch. In a few hours, he would be back in his study, reviewing the day's briefings and preparing for the official duties that tomorrow would bring. But first, he would stop by each child's bedroom to observe their peaceful sleep and reassure himself that they remained safe and content. These moments of quiet observation had become sacred to him, representing the successful completion of another day in which he had protected and nurtured the three most important people in his world. The landing was smooth, and Alexander was greeted by a minimal security detail and his personal assistant. No media had been alerted to his return, allowing him to travel home in the blessed anonymity that was increasingly rare for royal family members. During the drive through the quiet city streets, Alexander felt the weight of anticipation building. In approximately 72 hours, Maria Santos' interview would air in Brazil, and within days, excerpts would be circulating globally. The careful privacy he had maintained around his family's emotional life would end permanently, replaced by public scrutiny of their most intimate struggles and triumphs. The decision felt right, but that didn't eliminate the anxiety about potential consequences. The children would face increased attention at school, and their friends might treat them differently once the depth of their family's story became public knowledge. As they passed through the palace gates, Alexander made a mental note to schedule individual conversations with each child over the next few days, preparing them for the likely changes in how others might perceive and interact with them. The interview was done, the story was told, and now they would all face the consequences together. 3 months after the interview aired, Alexander stood in his private study reviewing the morning briefings while golden autumn sunlight filtered through the tall windows. The impact of Maria Santos' documentary had exceeded everyone's expectations, generating international discussion about modern monarchy, single parenthood, and the resilience of children facing loss. The initial broadcast in Brazil had drawn the largest audience for a documentary in the country's television history. Within hours, clips were circulating on social media platforms worldwide, with particular attention paid to Alexander's emotional discussion of bedtime routines and his children's different ways of processing grief. "Sir, the latest polling data shows remarkable results," announced Sarah Chen, his communications director, as she entered the study with a thick folder of reports. "Public approval ratings have reached their highest levels since your wedding to Princess Catherine. More importantly, the approval ratings specifically for your parenting have increased dramatically across all demographic groups." Alexander accepted the folder with mixed feelings. While positive public opinion made his official duties easier, the fact that his parenting was being measured and evaluated by strangers remained unsettling. The children had handled the attention with remarkable grace, but he remained protective of their privacy despite his decision to share their story. What about international response? Extraordinary. The documentary has been broadcast in 47 countries, and you've received invitations to speak at parenting conferences, single-parent support organizations, and grief counseling symposiums. Sarah paused, consulting her notes. UNICEF has formally requested your involvement in their campaign supporting children who have lost parents in conflict zones. The UNICEF invitation particularly intrigued Alexander. Using his experience to support other grieving families felt like a meaningful way to honor both Catherine's memory and the vulnerability he had shared in Brazil. The children's schools report that media attention has been manageable but noticeable. Isabella's headmistress says several students have approached her with questions about their own family situations, suggesting that your openness has encouraged others to discuss difficult topics. This outcome had been one of Alexander's hopes when deciding to participate in the interview. If his children's story could help other young people feel less alone in their struggles, the public exposure would be justified. A knock at the study door interrupted their conversation. Princess Isabella entered, carrying her school bag and wearing the confident expression that had become her trademark since the interview aired. "Daddy, may I speak with you privately?" she asked, glancing politely at Sarah. "Of course, darling. Sarah, could we continue this discussion this afternoon?" After Sarah departed, Isabella settled into the leather chair across from Alexander's desk, her posture straight but relaxed. At 14, she had developed a remarkable ability to engage with complex topics while maintaining the natural warmth that reminded Alexander so much of Catherine. "I wanted to talk about the UNICEF invitation," Isabella said without preamble. "I know you're considering it, and I think you should accept." Alexander raised an eyebrow, impressed by her directness but curious about her reasoning. "What makes you think that's the right choice?" "Because our story helped people understand that families can be different but still strong. If you can help children in worse situations than ours feel less afraid or alone, then sharing our privacy was worth something important." Isabella paused thoughtfully. "Also, I think Mummy would want us to use our experience to help others." The maturity of Isabella's analysis never ceased to amaze Alexander. She had inherited Catherine's analytical mind, but had developed her own moral framework through processing loss at such a young age. "How do you think Michael and Sophie would feel about additional public involvement?" "Michael wants to help other kids who have lost parents. He asked if there are rugby programs for children in refugee camps." Isabella smiled. "Sophie doesn't fully understand the larger implications, but she likes the idea that talking about Mummy might help other children miss their parents less." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Michael himself, still wearing his rugby kit after morning practice. At 12 years old, he had grown several inches since the interview and was beginning to show the athletic build that would serve him well in sports. "Dad, are we really going to work with UNICEF?" he asked, dropping into another chair with the casual energy that characterized his approach to most situations. "We're discussing it. What are your thoughts?" "I think it would be brilliant. Captain Morrison told me about children in Syria who have lost both parents and live in camps with no proper football pitches or sports equipment." Michael's expression grew serious. "If we can help them get better resources or just feel less sad, we should definitely do it." The simple directness of Michael's moral reasoning reflected his natural empathy and growing understanding of privilege and responsibility. Like his sister, he had processed their family's experience in ways that enhanced rather than diminished his capacity for compassion. Sophie appeared in the doorway, having apparently followed her siblings to the study. At 8 years old, she possessed an intuitive understanding of family dynamics that often surprised adults. "Are we talking about the sad children far away?" she asked, climbing onto Alexander's lap with the casual affection that remained one of his greatest daily joys. "We're talking about whether our family should work with an organization that helps children around the world," Alexander explained gently. "The ones who don't have mummies or daddies." "Some of them, yes." Sophie considered this seriously, her small face scrunched in concentration. "We could tell them that being sad is normal, but that people still love them even when they can't see them." The profound simplicity of Sophie's suggestion captured something that complex policy discussions often missed. Children facing loss needed reassurance that their emotions were normal and that they remained worthy of love despite their circumstances. "I think that's exactly the kind of message we could share," Alexander said, hugging Sophie gently. The family discussion was interrupted by Mrs. Hartley, who appeared with the morning's mail and a particular expression that Alexander had learned to recognize as significant news. "Your Highness, there's a letter from Maria Santos that I believe you'll want to see immediately," she announced, extending an envelope with Brazilian postal markings. Alexander opened the letter carefully, nodding the personal stationery rather than official journalism letterhead. Maria's handwriting was elegant and confident, reflecting the professionalism that had made their interview so successful. The letter contained surprising news. Maria's documentary about the royal family had won the International Emmy Award for Outstanding Documentary, bringing global recognition to the story of their family's resilience. More significantly, the letter included an invitation for Alexander and the children to visit Brazil for the award ceremony, with all proceeds from the documentary being donated to an international foundation supporting single-parent families. Children, how would you feel about returning to Brazil for a celebration of the documentary about our family? Isabella's eyes lit up immediately. Could we see Maria again and maybe visit some of the places where children need help? Could we watch football in Brazil? Michael added, his priorities clearly established. Would there be other children there who miss their mummies? Sophie asked, demonstrating her growing understanding of their shared experience with loss. Alexander looked at his 3 children, each responding to the invitation through the lens of their individual personalities and interests, but all showing enthusiasm for continued involvement in sharing their story. I think we should go, he decided. Mrs. Hartley, please coordinate with Sarah to begin planning a return visit to Brazil, and please accept the UNICEF invitation as well. The decision felt natural and right, representing the next phase of their family's evolution from private struggle to public service. The interview with Maria Santos had been a leap of faith that had ultimately strengthened rather than compromised their family bonds. Over the following weeks, preparations for the Brazil trip and UNICEF involvement revealed how much the children had grown through their experience of public vulnerability. Isabella researched Brazilian culture and Portuguese language basics. Michael investigated youth sports programs in refugee communities, and Sophie practiced describing her feelings about missing her mother in terms that younger children might understand. The transformation was remarkable. What had begun as a family protecting itself through privacy had evolved into a family sharing its strength through transparency. They remained deeply private about certain aspects of their lives, but they had learned to distinguish between privacy for protection and secrecy from shame. Catherine's memory was honored not through preservation of grief, but through continuation of love expressed in service to others. The children understood intuitively that their mother's values lived on through their actions, creating a legacy that extended far beyond their personal loss. As Alexander watched his children prepare for their expanded public role, he realized that Maria Santos' interview had accomplished something he never could have anticipated. It had not just told their story, it had transformed their understanding of their own strength and their capacity to help others find similar resilience. The boy who had worried about protecting everyone had become a young man committed to supporting vulnerable children. The girl who had carried adult responsibilities too early had become a thoughtful leader capable of inspiring peers and adults alike. The little girl who talked to her mother's portrait had become a powerful advocate for the ongoing bonds between children and deceased parents. They were no longer just a royal family recovering from tragedy. They had become a family whose recovery had revealed resources of strength that could be shared with others facing similar challenges. The Brazil trip would mark 18 months since Catherine's death, a milestone that felt significant for its distance from the raw immediacy of early grief and its proximity to a new kind of normal that honored both loss and hope. Standing in his study as the children's excited voices echoed through the palace hallways, Alexander felt profound gratitude for the decision to trust Maria Santos with their story. The risk had been enormous, but the rewards had exceeded anything he could have imagined. His children were thriving not despite their loss, but through their determination to transform loss into purpose. They had learned that healing meant not forgetting Catherine, but carrying forward her values of compassion, service, and love in ways that blessed others facing similar darkness. The interview had ended their isolation and begun their mission. They were ready for whatever came next.